Chapter 1. The Mysterious Letter. It was a crisp, quiet Tuesday morning when Miss Jane Marple received a letter that would soon draw her into the heart of an enigma. The postman had arrived earlier than usual, and Miss Marple, in her habitual routine of knitting and sipping tea, had only just noticed the white envelope resting on her small wooden table. It was unmistakable, an envelope marked with the seal of St. David's Village Police. With a quiet sigh, Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and picked up the letter. The smooth paper was a sign of official business, and she couldn't help but feel a stir of curiosity. After all, St. David's was a village that Miss Marple had only visited a few times, but she was no stranger to the affairs of small, tightly knit communities. Her experiences in St. Mary Mead had taught her to never underestimate the complexities that lay behind the lives of seemingly simple folk. She opened the letter with a methodical, measured motion and read the contents. "Dear Miss Marple, we hope this letter finds you well. We are writing to request your assistance in a very serious matter. A particularly brutal and troubling case has arisen here in St. David's involving the murder of a young girl, Anne Summers. The circumstances of her death have left the community shaken, and we are at a loss as to how to proceed. We would be most grateful for your invaluable assistance in solving this case. Yours sincerely, Inspector Godfrey, St. David's Police." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled briefly as she read the words. Murder, even in the most peaceful villages, was an occurrence that always stirred the quiet undercurrents of human nature. And though she had never been to St. David's before, the notion of helping with an investigation intrigued her. The village, no doubt, had a story to tell. And she was certain, as she often was, that the clues to the truth would lie not in grand gestures, but in the smallest of details. She rose from her chair, placing the letter on the table and smoothing down her cardigan. St. Mary Mead, after all, had been home for many years, but the call of a new mystery was one Miss Marple could not resist. With a nod to herself, she fetched her coat from the hallway cupboard, her mind already turning over the words in the letter. St. David's was but a short journey away by train, and before long Miss Marple found herself arriving at the small village. As she stepped off the train, the cool breeze carried the scent of freshly turned earth and flowers, reminders of the rural charm that often lured city dwellers into the embrace of village life. But today there was no escaping the oppressive mood that seemed to hang over St. David's like a fog. The village was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of townsfolk who exchanged hushed whispers as they passed. The scene outside the station was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the dread that Miss Marple could feel simmering in the air. The villagers, as she passed them, avoided eye contact, their faces drawn in sorrow. She had been to enough villages to know that when tragedy struck, it left its imprint on the very streets. By the time she arrived at the village square, she was met by a tall man in a dark suit, a figure who stood out from the otherwise ordinary townsfolk. He was pacing back and forth near the town hall, looking quite out of place in his serious demeanour. "Miss Marple, I presume?" he said with a slight bow, his voice filled with relief. "I'm Inspector Godfrey, St. David's Police. I'm so glad you could come." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone as composed as ever, though her mind was already turning over the details in the letter. "I understand you've had a rather troubling case." "Troubling is an understatement, I'm afraid," Godfrey said, his face etched with concern. "A young girl named Anne Summers has been found murdered, brutally so. Her body was discovered near Thornfield Cottage, just on the outskirts of the village. She had been attacked, and her hands and feet were broken. It's a dreadful thing to have happened here. This sort of thing doesn't belong in a place like St. David's." "I can see how it would be a shock to everyone," Miss Marple murmured, her tone thoughtful as she surveyed the village. The suddenness of it, the cruelty. People who have lived peacefully for years are the ones most affected by such violence. Exactly, Godfrey agreed, nodding gravely. And we don't know where to start. We've interviewed a few villagers, but no one seems to have any useful information. She was well liked, it seems, and there were no indications that she had enemies. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, taking in the scene. The village, though picturesque, was now shrouded in an undeniable heaviness, as if the murder had cast a long shadow over every familiar corner. She could sense the underlying tension in the air. "I'm sure you've already spoken to the girl's family?" Miss Marple inquired, her eyes sharp as she turned to the inspector. "Yes, we've spoken to her parents. They're devastated, of course. But they can't shed any light on who might have done this. That's why we've turned to you, Miss Marple. We're in need of someone who can read people, who can see what's hidden beneath the surface." "I'll be glad to help," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps if I meet with them we might find something that hasn't been considered yet." Godfrey nodded, clearly relieved. "I'll take you there now, it's just down the road." As they made their way through the village, Miss Marple couldn't help but reflect on the nature of small-town tragedies. People often thought that such places were free from malice or intrigue, but Miss Marple knew better. It was always the quiet ones, the ones whose lives appeared most ordinary, who held the deepest secrets. And she was certain that Anne Summer's death had its roots buried in the fabric of this peaceful village, just waiting to be unearthed. With every step, the mystery seemed to grow more intricate, and Miss Marple was more than ready to begin peeling back the layers. Chapter 2. A Kind-Hearted Girl. The Summers family home sat on the edge of St. David's village, modest but inviting, nestled behind a well-kept hedge and a row of cheerful flower pots. The front garden was a patchwork of neat borders, and there was a calmness to the house that spoke of lives led by routine and quiet respectability. As Miss Marple approached the small, cottage-like dwelling, she couldn't help but appreciate how fitting it was for the family it housed, a family of simple but steadfast character. When Mrs. Summers opened the door, there was no mistaking the deep sorrow etched into her features. A small woman, her hair dusted with silver, Mrs. Summers' face was pale with grief. Yet as she welcomed Miss Marple into the house, there was a certain dignity in her manner. She led the way into a cosy sitting room where a fire was flickering softly in the hearth. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, and despite the sorrowful occasion, it exuded a warmth that made it clear this was a home that had been loved and cared for. "Please, Miss Marple, do sit down," Mrs. Summers said, her voice wavering slightly as she gestured toward a chair by the fire. "We're so grateful that you've come. We know you'll help us find the answers." Miss Marple, with her usual grace, accepted the invitation, settling herself comfortably into the armchair. Her sharp eyes swept the room, noting the framed photographs on the walls, most of them showing a young girl with a bright smile, her features so like her parents that there was no doubt she was their pride and joy. The absence of Anne Summers, who had once filled this space with her presence, was palpable. "I'll do what I can," Miss Marple said gently, her voice soft but carrying a weight of experience that could not be ignored. "I'm sure there is much we can learn from those who knew her best." Mr. Summers entered the room at that moment, a tall, stoic man with a weary expression. His face was drawn, and his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights he had no doubt endured since the tragic discovery of his daughter's death. His gait was slow, and his shoulders stooped under the burden of grief, but he was composed nonetheless, the type of man who bore his troubles in silence. He too welcomed Miss Marple, though there was no denying the sadness that hung heavy in the air between them. "We've been trying to make sense of it all," Mr. Summers said, lowering himself into the chair opposite Miss Marple. His voice was thick with sorrow and he dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. But there was something in the way he spoke that Miss Marple found revealing. A subtle undercurrent of anxiety. "You must be terribly upset," Miss Marple said quietly, her eyes kind but knowing. "Such a loss is never easy to bear." Mrs. Summers nodded, her voice trembling. Anne was such a sweet girl. Everyone loved her. She worked at the shop in the village every morning, and then, in the evenings, she'd tutor children. She adored her students. She was always so eager to help them, and they loved her in return. We were so proud of her. But I never thought something like this could happen to her. "The village must be in shock," Miss Marple remarked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed Mrs. Summers's reaction. There was something in the way she had spoken, something offhanded about the description of Anne's work. But Miss Marple said nothing of it just yet. "She was a good girl," Mr. Summers added, his voice steady despite the pain that clearly lingered beneath the surface. "She had everything ahead of her. Her future seemed so bright. She was engaged once, you know." Miss Marple's interest piqued, and she leaned forward slightly. "Engaged, you say?" "Yes," Mr. Summers continued, his expression darkening. "To a man named Rupert Langley. He was from a nearby village. A charming young man, at least he seemed to be. But it all ended badly. Anne was heartbroken. She discovered that Rupert had been married before, and when she found out, he didn't tell her the truth. It was a dreadful shock to her, and the engagement was broken off." Mrs. Summers sniffed, dabbing her eyes once more with her handkerchief. She took it hard. She was always so trusting, so open-hearted. And for him to deceive her like that, well, it was too much for her. Miss Marple observed the couple carefully. There was no doubt in her mind that Anne's heart had indeed been broken by Rupert Langley's deception, but she couldn't help but wonder, was there more to the story than they were revealing? Was there any bitterness in Anne's heart for the man who had betrayed her? The details were vague, and Miss Marple's mind began to work, spinning out the potential threads that could lead to the truth. "Do you happen to have Rupert's address?" Miss Marple asked gently, her tone casual but keen. "I believe it might be important to speak with him. Perhaps there is more that can be learned from him about Anne's state of mind in the days leading up to her death." Mrs. Summers rose from her chair and retrieved a small slip of paper from the mantelpiece. She handed it to Miss Marple with a slight tremble in her hands. "Here it is. But I can't imagine how Rupert could be involved in all of this. He's been gone for several days now, and he seemed so upset when they broke up. He couldn't have had anything to do with it." Miss Marple accepted the paper with a quiet nod. She could sense the deep hope in Mrs. Summers's words that the man who had hurt their daughter might not be connected to this gruesome crime. Yet Miss Marple was not so easily convinced. She had learned over the years that the simplest explanations were often the most elusive. "You never know, Mrs. Summers," Miss Marple said softly, rising from her seat. "Sometimes the answers we seek are hidden in plain sight. I will speak with Rupert and see what he has to say, but in the meantime, try to rest. You've been through much." As she turned to leave, Miss Marple felt a subtle weight in the air, an intuition that this was only the beginning of a far more complex mystery. Anne's death, she was certain, had a deeper story to tell, and she would uncover it, one piece at a time. Chapter 3. A Man on the Run. The afternoon sun hung low over St. David's as Miss Marple and Inspector Godfrey made their way down the winding lane that led to Rupert Langley's cottage. The village seemed oddly still, the only sound being the distant twittering of birds and the faint rustle of leaves in the soft breeze. It was the kind of day that suggested nothing could possibly be amiss, Yet Miss Marple's keen senses were alert to the undercurrent of tension that lingered in the air. Rupert Langley's cottage, though modest, was perched at the edge of a small copse of trees, a place where one could enjoy a quiet life away from the busy centre of St. David's. The ivy that crawled up its stone walls was neat but unmistakably aged, giving the cottage a picturesque quality. However, there was no warmth in its appearance today, only the cold, stark reality of its recent emptiness. They were met at the door by the landlady, a small, elderly woman with thick spectacles perched precariously on the end of her nose. Her hair, grey and wispy, framed her face like a cloud, and her voice, when she spoke, had a nervous tremor. "You're looking for Mr. Langley?" she asked, peering up at them with wide eyes, as if she had not quite believed their arrival. "He's not here, you see. Left 3 days ago, just like that." She snapped her fingers, the sound small but final. "Left?" Miss Marple inquired gently, her tone suggesting that she had already noticed the disarray of the cottage, the absence of the usual signs of a well-kept home. "Was it sudden, then?" The landlady nodded. "Aye, sudden enough. Not a word to me, just packed his things and went. I'd not have thought it of him. Quiet, polite young man. Always paid his rent on time, didn't make any trouble. But then, all at once, he was gone." "Did he say where he was going?" Inspector Godfrey asked, his voice a little sharper than usual. The woman shook her head. "No, not a word. Not to me, anyway. And no, he didn't leave any note or anything. He just vanished." She seemed to take a small comfort in this, as if her explanation was adequate, but Miss Marple's mind was already working, turning over the possibilities. "Could he have been angry about the broken engagement?" Miss Marple asked thoughtfully, her gaze fixed on the empty cottage, as though looking for clues hidden in plain sight. Inspector Godfrey frowned, looking between the two women. "It's possible, Miss Marple, but there's more to it, isn't there? People don't just vanish without reason, especially not after something like that. And there's no sign of any other foul play here." "No sign, no," Miss Marple agreed, though her voice was calm and unhurried. "But the timing does make one think, doesn't it? A man betrayed in love, leaving without a word. It's not as simple as it seems." The landlady shuffled her feet, clearly uncomfortable with the subject of Rupert's disappearance. She glanced nervously at the door behind her, as though expecting him to come bounding through it at any moment, explaining away his sudden departure. But Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere, focusing on the subtle details she had observed, the way the small things seemed out of place, as though Rupert had not just left, but had been pulled away by something urgent, something he could not share. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone more soothing now, as though coaxing the truth from the landlady would be the easiest thing in the world. The landlady hesitated, her hands fluttering around her apron. "I don't know, miss, I really don't. He kept to himself mostly, but there was one thing. Just before he left, he did get a letter. I didn't see it, mind you, but I did notice him reading it in a hurry one morning. It wasn't long after that he started packing." Miss Marple's sharp eyes flicked to the inspector. "A letter?" she said softly. "Interesting. If we could find that letter, it might shed some light on why he left so suddenly." Inspector Godfrey nodded, although he was clearly skeptical. "You think it's that simple?" "Nothing is ever quite as simple as it seems, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm yet firm, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But that letter may hold the answers we need." With no other leads to follow at that moment, the inspector turned back to the landlady. "If you find anything at all that might help us, don't hesitate to contact me," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. As they left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind was busy with the pieces she had collected. Rupert Langley's sudden departure, 3 days after his engagement to Anne Summers ended was too much of a coincidence to ignore. The broken engagement, the mysterious letter, the absence of any explanation, it all pointed to something more than mere heartbreak. But what was Rupert hiding? And why had he left with such urgency? "Do you think he's guilty, Miss Marple?" Inspector Godfrey asked, his voice low as they walked back to the village. Miss Marple's gaze was distant, focused on the path ahead, her mind already turning the case over like a jigsaw puzzle. "I don't know, Inspector, but I suspect Rupert Langley's story isn't as simple as it appears." The inspector gave her a glance, but Miss Marple merely smiled knowingly, her steps slow and measured. She had a feeling that the answers lay not in what had been said, but in what had been left unsaid. Things only a careful observer could uncover. And Miss Marple, as always, was more than ready to begin her work. Chapter 4. The Shopkeeper's Tale. The small shop on the corner of St. David's Village was as neat and tidy as the village itself, its shelves stocked with an assortment of goods that suggested a long history of loyal customers and careful management. The kind of shop where people came not just for their daily needs, but to exchange the latest bits of gossip, or perhaps to share the small but important moments of village life. Miss Marple stood just outside the window, taking in the humble exterior, the sign reading Hargrove's General Goods, swinging gently in the breeze. As she entered, the bell above the door chimed a soft greeting, and she was met by a man in his mid-40s, with thinning hair and a ruddy complexion. Mr. Hargrove, the shopkeeper, looked up with a start, and though his greeting was polite, his eyes betrayed a deep unease. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. I wasn't expecting company, not today." He smiled, but the effort seemed forced. His hands were fidgeting nervously with the edge of his apron as he wiped his palms. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm afraid it's a difficult matter that brings me here," Miss Marple began, her voice warm but direct. "I'm investigating the tragic death of Anne Summers, and I understand she worked here. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand more about her life here." "Ah, Anne," he said with a wistful smile, though it quickly faded. "She was a good worker, that one. Always on time, never a complaint. Took pride in everything she did. A real gem, if you ask me." Miss Marple noted the shopkeeper's evident fondness for the young woman. He spoke of her with a sincerity that spoke volumes about Anne's character and work ethic. However, the tension in his voice suggested there was more he had yet to reveal. Miss Marple waited, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to encourage him to continue. "Did Anne have any troubles during her time working here?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but piercing. Hargrove hesitated, his eyes darting to the back of the shop before he seemed to make up his mind. "There was a young man, Robert Finch. He worked here before Anne, you see. But, well, I had to let him go." Miss Marple's sharp eyes met his. "And why was that?" "He was caught stealing. Anne was the one who spotted him, right before I did. She told me about it, and I had no choice but to dismiss him on the spot." Miss Marple could tell that the memory of that moment still troubled Mr. Hargrove. He shifted uneasily, and she could sense that something about this incident was not as straightforward as it seemed. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft but commanding. "And how did Mr. Finch take to being caught?" Mr. Hargrove's face darkened, his hands now gripping the edge of the counter. "He was angry, Miss Marple. Very angry. I'd never seen him so furious. He threatened her, said he'd get revenge. Of course, I thought he was just mouthing off in the heat of the moment. People say things when they're embarrassed, don't they? I didn't take it seriously at the time." "Did Anne seem worried about it?" Miss Marple pressed. "No," Hargrove replied quickly. "She wasn't one to worry much about such things. Quite a strong girl, Anne. She just got on with her work and didn't let it bother her. But now..." He trailed off, his gaze unfocused, clearly disturbed by the turn of events that had led to Anne's untimely death. Miss Marple absorbed this information quietly, her mind working rapidly. The idea of revenge was not new to her. It was a motive that had appeared in many a case she had investigated over the years. But she could not shake the feeling that something else was at play here, something deeper than mere anger. A sense of unease settled in her chest as she watched the shopkeeper. "Do you happen to have Mr. Finch's address?" she asked, her voice steady but firm, as though she were asking for a simple, ordinary piece of information. Hargrove hesitated. I'm not sure. I don't usually keep such details, but..." He went to the back of the shop, rifling through a drawer, and returned with a piece of paper. "Here it is. Finch's address. He's renting a small room on Maple Lane just outside the village." Miss Marple took the slip of paper, her fingers brushing the inked address. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. I appreciate your help. If you remember anything else, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me." The shopkeeper nodded, though his expression was one of uncertainty. "I do hope you find the answers, Miss Marple. This whole thing has shaken the village to its core. I just wish I'd done more, perhaps seen the signs earlier." Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding, but there was a sharpness to her gaze that suggested her mind was already moving forward, sifting through the puzzle pieces with precision. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Mr. Hargrove, the signs are not as obvious as we'd like them to be, but the truth is always there, waiting to be uncovered." With that, she turned and walked out of the shop, her mind already considering Robert Finch's role in the unfolding drama. The threat of revenge, the sudden disappearance of a young man who had been dismissed for theft. These were not small details. Miss Marple knew that in the quiet corners of St. David's, the key to solving Anne's murder was hidden in plain sight. And she would find it, just as she always did. As the door closed behind her, the village of St. David's seemed to breathe a little heavier, the weight of its secrets pressing closer to the surface. Chapter 5. A Thief's Secret. The morning had brought with it a crisp breeze, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fresh beginnings, a stark contrast to the grim task that lay before Miss Marple. As she walked down the cobbled path leading to Robert Finch's cottage, the village of St. David's seemed to stand still in the wake of the tragedy that had occurred days before. The usual hum of life in a peaceful village had been replaced with a solemn hush, as if the very air was holding its breath. Robert Finch's cottage was small, its stone facade softened by ivy that clung to it like the secrets of its occupant. The door was ajar, and as Miss Marple knocked lightly, she could hear the faint clink of china inside, as if someone were preparing tea. The constable who had been assigned to the case greeted her at the door, his expression professional but tinged with concern. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I regret to inform you that Robert Finch is not in any condition to speak. He's had an accident, quite a nasty fall. He's been taken to the hospital." "An accident, you say?" Miss Marple inquired, raising an eyebrow. "How curious, and how severe?" "Quite severe, I'm afraid," the constable replied. "He fell from a ladder while working at his cottage, broke his leg, badly enough that he'll be out of action for some time. I'm certain, however, that it has no connection to the case. He's been nothing but cooperative since we began our inquiry, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's been a bit distracted by his own misfortunes." Miss Marple studied the constable's face for a moment before nodding. "I see. Well, I shall have to follow this lead later, but for now I suppose I must turn my attention elsewhere." The constable agreed, and Miss Marple made her way to the next destination, Lucy Mayfield's home. Lucy Mayfield's house sat at the far end of the village, its garden neatly trimmed and the flower beds bursting with colour, despite the heavy cloud that seemed to have settled over the village in recent days. As Miss Marple approached, the door opened before she could knock, and a woman who could only be Lucy's mother stood before her. Mrs. Mayfield's face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, and though she had a composed manner, there was a palpable heaviness in the air as she welcomed Miss Marple inside. "I'm so sorry to trouble you, Mrs. Mayfield," Miss Marple said with her usual gentleness, "but I need to ask a few questions regarding your daughter's lessons with Anne Summers. It may be the key to understanding the tragic events surrounding her death." Mrs. Mayfield nodded, her face hardening slightly. "I understand, Miss Marple. It's been a dreadful time for us all. You need not worry about me. Please, ask your questions." The house was as neat as one could expect for a family who had recently experienced such loss. The sitting room, though modest, was warm and inviting. Mrs. Mayfield gestured toward an armchair, and Miss Marple sat down, her gaze flicking momentarily to the window-sill, where a small vase of flowers sat. The vibrant colours seemed out of place in the otherwise sombre atmosphere. "I understand that Anne tutored Lucy regularly," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but probing. "Can you tell me how Lucy reacted to Anne's death?" Mrs. Mayfield sighed deeply. "Lucy adored Anne. They were closer than I realised, I think. But since Anne's passing, she's been distant, not herself at all." She paused, then added in a hushed tone, "Lucy was often in the garden at the back of the house after her lessons with Anne. She said she liked the fresh air, you see. But lately, she's been too withdrawn to talk about it. She never once mentioned anything unusual." Miss Marple's eyes flicked towards the back of the house, where a small path led to a garden that bordered the woods. "I see. And you said she's been more withdrawn lately?" "Yes," Mrs. Mayfield replied, her voice shaking slightly. "She seemed afraid of something, though she wouldn't say what. I thought it might have been the news about Anne's death, but now I wonder." Her words trailed off as if she were lost in thought. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, and she stood, her eyes focused on the garden beyond. "Mrs. Mayfield, could I take a look at the garden? It may offer us some answers." The garden was small but well maintained, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a few flower beds that seemed to overflow with colour. At the far end of the garden, a stone well stood, its iron cover slightly askew. Mrs. Mayfield, noticing Miss Marple's gaze, seemed to stiffen. "I'm afraid the well has been a source of some distress," Mrs. Mayfield said quietly. "Lucy was always drawn to it. I never thought much of it, but she seemed to spend hours there on some days, staring into the depths." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Could you show me, Mrs. Mayfield?" With a soft nod, Mrs. Mayfield led her to the well. As they approached, Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the ground, noting a few disturbed patches of earth around the base. It wasn't until they reached the well that Mrs. Mayfield's composure began to crack. She motioned to the opening. "I've been too afraid to look myself," Mrs. Mayfield whispered. "But Lucy, we found her. She was in the well." The words struck Miss Marple like a physical blow, though she kept her composure. The police had already removed the body, but the grim discovery had turned the entire village upside down. "Lucy is dead?" Miss Marple asked softly, though she already knew the answer. "Yes," Mrs. Mayfield replied, her voice breaking. "She's been strangled, Miss Marple. We don't understand why." Miss Marple's mind began to churn with possibilities. The death of Anne Summers, so violent and mysterious, now seemed linked to the death of Lucy. Both girls had been in close contact, yet the connection between them remained elusive. But Miss Marple was certain that the well, the mysterious mark on Lucy's soul, held the key. Something had frightened the girl, and Miss Marple would find out what it was. "I believe Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Mayfield. "That we are uncovering something far darker than we could have imagined." Chapter 6. A startling revelation. The village of St. David's, once the epitome of pastoral calm, now seemed cloaked in an unsettling silence. Miss Marple's thoughts were far from her usual musings on village matters as she made her way down the gravel path leading to the Mayfield household. The tragic loss of young Lucy, whose life had been cut short so violently, had left an indelible mark on the village. Now, as Miss Marple approached the house, she could feel the weight of grief that hung over it, even from a distance. Mrs. Mayfield, the girl's mother, was a frail woman, her features softened by sorrow and fatigue. She greeted Miss Marple with a quiet nod, her eyes red from weeping, though she seemed determined to carry on in the face of such unspeakable tragedy. Her hands, though still delicate, were steady as she opened the door wider, ushering the detective into the dimly lit hallway of their modest cottage. "I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you're here, Miss Marple," Mrs. Mayfield said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace that had settled over the house since Lucy's death. "I don't know where to turn. The shock of it all. Lucy, my poor darling. She was everything to us." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile but said nothing, letting the words settle into the space between them. She had seen enough grief in her time to know that sometimes silence spoke more clearly than any words could. "We were just so close to getting some answers," Mrs. Mayfield continued, her voice breaking slightly. "And then Simon, he's taken it so hard, Miss Marple. He's been withdrawn, not himself. And then just this morning, he came to me, with his face all scratched up." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at the mention of Simon, Mrs. Mayfield's only son. The boy had always been a quiet presence around the village, a sensitive and thoughtful child, though he had never been particularly outgoing. But now Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the stairs that led up to the second floor, her mind already piecing together a puzzle that had yet to reveal its full shape. "Simon is upstairs?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice almost a murmur. "Yes," Mrs. Mayfield replied, glancing anxiously toward the staircase. "He won't speak to anyone about what happened, but he seemed so different this morning. More withdrawn than I've ever seen him. I'm not sure what to think. He barely ate, hardly said a word, only told me he wanted to be alone." Miss Marple nodded in understanding, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The scratches fresh on the boy's face, how they tugged at the edges of a mystery she was beginning to unravel. Something in Simon's behavior, in his quiet distress, had caught her attention. "I would like to speak with Simon," Miss Marple said gently, though the firmness in her tone brooked no argument. "Perhaps he will open up to me in time." Mrs. Mayfield hesitated, her gaze flickering uneasily. "I don't know if he will, Miss Marple. He's in such a state." Miss Marple's expression softened, but there was an undeniable steel beneath her gentleness. "Sometimes people need someone to listen, someone who won't judge them. I believe I may be able to help Simon find his way back from this grief." With a reluctant nod, Mrs. Mayfield stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to ascend the stairs. The air in the upstairs corridor was heavy, and the quiet that had descended upon the house seemed almost oppressive. At the end of the hallway, Simon's bedroom door stood ajar. Miss Marple knocked lightly before stepping in, her presence quiet and unassuming. Simon Mayfield sat at the edge of his bed, his eyes downcast, his face pale. His clothes, though clean, were wrinkled, and his tousled hair seemed to reflect the chaos of his thoughts. As Miss Marple entered the room, he looked up, his face a mask of confusion and sorrow. His gaze flickered over her briefly before returning to the floor, his expression clouded with a mixture of guilt and despair. "Simon," Miss Marple began softly, "your mother is very concerned about you. She says you've been in great distress since Lucy's death." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, but he didn't speak. Miss Marple, ever patient, took a step closer, her voice gentle, but with an edge of firmness. "Simon, I understand that you may feel overwhelmed, but sometimes when we keep things inside, they can become much more difficult to bear. You're not alone in this. You can trust me, and if there's anything you need to say, I'll listen." For a long moment, there was silence between them. Simon's fingers twitched nervously, and Miss Marple could see the weight of something dark, sitting heavily on his heart. Then finally, his voice broke the silence, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I did it," Simon whispered, his voice barely audible. "I killed them both." Miss Marple's eyes widened only slightly, but her composure remained unwavering. "What do you mean, Simon? Who did you kill?" Simon's eyes, wide with fear and guilt, flicked up to meet hers. "Anne and Lucy. I killed them both." His confession came in a torrent, as if the floodgates had finally opened. He explained how, in a moment of fury and confusion, he had taken the life of both girls. Anne, who had rejected him, and Lucy, who had witnessed his crime. His face was twisted with remorse as he spoke, and his hands shook uncontrollably. "I never meant for it to go this far," Simon continued, his voice cracking. "But when Lucy saw me, I couldn't let her tell anyone. She wouldn't keep quiet. I had to stop her. And then Anne, she never loved me like I loved her. I thought if I could just make her see me. But then I lost control." Miss Marple's mind raced, but she kept her expression composed, her voice calm and reassuring. "It's important, Simon, that you tell the truth now. It will be the first step towards understanding what happened. And in time, healing." As Simon wept, Miss Marple stood still, her thoughts already forming a clearer picture of the tragedy that had befallen the Mayfield family. The dark secrets that had festered in the shadows were now brought into the light, and with it, the terrible weight of guilt that would follow Simon Mayfield for the rest of his life. Chapter 7. The Unravelling. The soft murmur of the wind through the trees outside was the only sound that broke the stillness of the Mayfield household. The air seemed thick with the weight of Simon's confession, as if the very room had closed in on itself. Miss Marple sat across from Simon Mayfield, her gaze steady and unflinching, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Simon, a boy not yet fully grown into himself, sat hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly together, as if trying to hold on to some semblance of control. It was a scene Miss Marple had encountered before: guilt, fear, and the subtle unravelling of a mind under the strain of a crime committed. Yet even in the midst of such a revelation, she remained calm, her years of experience in the village teaching her how to navigate the emotional undercurrents of human nature. Simon's confession was not unexpected, but its details were both chilling and sorrowful. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Simon said, his voice trembling, as he stared at the floor, unable to meet Miss Marple's eyes. "It all happened so fast. I never meant to kill her. Or Lucy." Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable, though her mind was working quickly, processing the words as they came. She had heard confessions before, and she knew that the truth often emerged piece by piece, like a puzzle gradually coming together. "Tell me, Simon," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of understanding. "Why did you kill Anne?" Simon's chest heaved as he struggled to find the words. "I loved her," he said, almost choking on the words. "I loved her so much, Miss Marple." but she never saw me that way. She was always so kind, so gentle, but she never looked at me the way I wanted her to. I tried to show her, tried to make her see how much I cared, but she didn't. She didn't feel the same. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Simon. "And when she rejected you," she asked, her voice steady, "what happened then?" Simon's eyes filled with shame, and he looked away. I couldn't take it. She didn't deserve to be with someone like me, and I thought if I could just make her see him, if I could make her feel what I felt, then maybe she would understand. I lost control. When I was with her, I hurt her. I broke her arms, and then... His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, as though trying to block out the horror of what he had just confessed. Miss Marple sat in silence, her mind carefully piecing together the fragments of Simon's story. She had suspected, of course, that Anne's death had been the result of something deeply personal, but now the full weight of Simon's jealousy and desperation was clear. But there was more. There was another layer to this tragedy. "You killed her," Miss Marple said, her voice softer now, "because of your love for her. But when Lucy saw what you had done, you felt you had no choice but to silence her, didn't you?" Simon nodded miserably, his voice barely audible. "She saw everything. She came into the room when I was hurting Anne. I didn't want her to tell anyone. I thought she would go straight to Mother and Father, and then everything would be ruined. She kept saying she would, that she would tell them what I had done." He looked up at Miss Marple, his eyes wild with fear. "I couldn't let her do that. I had to stop her." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression still calm but now tinged with a deep sadness. "So you killed Lucy too, out of fear? You couldn't bear the thought of anyone else knowing the truth?" Simon nodded, his voice breaking as the weight of his actions settled upon him. "I didn't mean to kill her. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted everything to stop. I wanted Anne to love me, and when she didn't, He choked on his words, his face contorting with guilt and despair. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Miss Marple. I never wanted to hurt them." Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind now fully understanding the complexities of Simon's actions. This was not the work of a cold-blooded killer, but rather the tragic outcome of a young man overwhelmed by his emotions, his feelings of rejection and jealousy spiraling into uncontrollable violence. He had not planned to kill either Anne or Lucy. His actions had been driven by impulse, by the fear of losing everything he had never truly had. "Simon," Miss Marple said gently, her voice filled with quiet compassion, "what you did was terrible, but it was not premeditated. You acted out of fear and desperation, but the truth has come out now, and it's important that you face the consequences of your actions." Simon looked up at her, his face a mask of anguish. "What will happen to me?" he whispered, his voice barely a sound. Miss Marple gave him a look that was both kind and resolute. "What happens next is not for me to decide, Simon, but you must face the truth. Only then can you begin to atone for what you have done." There was a long silence, and for the first time since Miss Marple had entered the room, Simon seemed to calm, as though some weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He nodded slowly, as if finally understanding that his path, no matter how difficult, would now be shaped by the truth. Miss Marple stood, her eyes soft but firm. "The road ahead will be difficult, Simon, but I believe you will find a way to make things right. It begins with the truth." As she left the room, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the pain that Simon's confession had unleashed, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The tragedy of Anne and Lucy was over, but the aftermath would ripple through the village for years to come. Yet, in her quiet way, Miss Marple had helped to unravel the mystery, one that had been concealed by fear, love, and jealousy. Now, with the truth revealed, it was time for St. David's to heal. Chapter 8. Justice is served. The small village of St. David's had begun to stir once again, though its usual tranquility was laced with an unspoken heaviness. The tragedy of Anne Summers and Lucy Mayfield had cast a long shadow over the tight-knit community, but with Simon Mayfield's confession, there was a sense that the wheels of justice had finally begun to turn. The young man had admitted his guilt, and though his remorse was palpable, there was no escaping the horror of his actions. Miss Marple, as always, had seen through the layers of grief, fear, and confusion to uncover the truth, and she stood in the center of the storm, calm, collected, and resolute. It was a skill she had honed over years of quiet observation, a quiet power that had earned her the respect of the local constabulary. Inspector Godfrey, who had accompanied Miss Marple to the Mayfield household to hear Simon's confession, stood beside her now in the village square. His face was ashen, the burden of the case evident in his eyes. He turned to Miss Marple, his tone still tinged with disbelief. "I still can't believe it," he said, shaking his head slowly. He was always so quiet and reserved, hardly ever spoke, never caused any trouble. How could someone like him? He broke off, struggling to find the right words. Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. "Appearances can be deceiving, Inspector," she replied, her voice calm but with a hint of warmth. The quiet ones often carry the heaviest burdens. Godfrey looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. She was not merely the kindly old lady of St. Mary Mead. She was a keen observer of human nature, someone whose understanding of the human condition went far beyond the surface. It was a quality that had enabled her to unravel this case when others might have been left grasping at straws. "You're quite right," he said quietly, nodding. "I suppose I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment. But you, Miss Marple, you saw it all, didn't you? The signs, the motivations. It was all there, wasn't it?" Miss Marple's smile remained gentle. "I simply paid attention to what was in front of me, Inspector. Simon Mayfield's guilt was plain enough to see, but the reasons behind it were more complex. He didn't set out to kill anyone, but the combination of jealousy, fear, and an overwhelming desire for control led him to make choices that spiraled out of his control." The inspector stood in silence for a moment, clearly contemplating her words. He had been a man of logic and reason, but Miss Marple's understanding of human emotions was a revelation to him. It wasn't just about the facts, it was about understanding the person behind the crime. "The village can begin to heal now," Godfrey said after a long pause. "Though I suppose it will take some time. Anne and Lucy were well loved, and Simon's actions have shaken everyone to the core." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes drifting to the quiet streets of St. David's. "Yes, the shadow of their deaths will linger for some time, but with the truth now known, perhaps the healing can begin." As she spoke, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the trees and the church bells rang softly in the distance. It was a peaceful sound, one that would soon drown out the memories of the horrors that had unfolded here. But for Miss Marple, there was always something more beneath the surface, another layer to uncover, another mystery to solve. The two of them turned towards the village's small cafe, the one where the locals often gathered for a cup of tea and a chat. The inspector seemed to sense that Miss Marple had reached the end of her thoughts on the matter. "Miss Marple, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done," Godfrey said earnestly. "Your insight, your sharp eye for detail. It's something I'll never forget."
"Oh, not at all, Inspector," she replied with a modest shrug. "I merely followed the trail where it led. Justice has been served, and that is all that matters." The inspector gave a small, appreciative smile. "You make it sound so simple, but I know it was far from easy. I suspect you'll be the one who is able to sleep soundly tonight, while the rest of us will be left pondering the deeper mysteries of life." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "There's always more to learn, Inspector, always more to uncover."
Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the familiar surroundings offering her a sense of peace after the storm. She sat down in her favourite armchair, the one by the window, and stared out at the village that was now slowly returning to its normal rhythm. The case was closed, Simon Mayfield's confession had been made, and the village could begin the long, slow process of healing. She sighed contentedly, her thoughts turning to the comforting prospect of tea. "I do believe I'll have a spot of tea," Miss Marple said to herself, settling back in her chair as she poured herself a delicate cup. The sunlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow on the room, and she closed her eyes for a moment, savouring the quiet peace that had finally returned to St. David's. "But there is always more to learn, isn't there?" she mused aloud, her voice soft and reflective. The world was full of mysteries, and though this particular one had been solved, Miss Marple knew that the next challenge was never far away. And so, with a small smile, she lifted her cup, ready for whatever the future would bring.